if I were to ask you, hey, to tell me about your health, and you said, oh yeah, I ran a marathon 21 years ago, that'd be an absurd way to answer for your health. But when I ask you, tell me about your education, 1,000 times in 1,000, people will say, oh, I graduated from SMU. Marathons aren't bad, and at the end of the day, neither is university. But it is all to say, we have to get, past this dependency on thinking that our formal education is the be all end all, that formal education is, the answer to what we know. It's not. And we've got to, continue to chip away at this future where everything you learn and all of your skills, they're there. You can see them. You can transact on them. They're going to unlock doors and gates just like the college degree did once upon a time. Like, that's the future we need.
Hi, I'm Ted Blosser, CEO and co-founder of WorkRamp, where we're redefining the corporate learning space with the world's first all-in-one learning cloud for employee and customer learning. Welcome to the Learn Podcast, where we learn from the biggest leaders in SaaS and hear what makes them successful. Hope you enjoy the show. All right, welcome back, everybody. We have a special guest on the Learn With podcast today. We have Dave Blake, CEO of Degree. Dave, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Well, before we jump into the meat of our conversation, I wanted to see if you could give us an elevator pitch on Degree. I think most people know Degree, but in case they don't, give us the quick elevator pitch.
Degreed, we say our mission is to jailbreak the degree. And what we always meant by that is we exist to build that future where learning is lifelong and where you get credit for everything you learn and all of your skills, irrespective of how or where you learn them. That's what we're all about.
Love that. If I was rating your pitch score, that'd be 5 for 5 on my scorecard there. So that's very well said. But Dave, I want to actually start with a really fun topic. I was doing I've known about you for a while being in the category, but I wanted to learn more about the early days. Back in 2012, you pioneered the learning experience platform category. So the LXP category. Tell us about those early days. What were the insights you saw? And then we'll talk about the evolution next, but let's go back in time to 2012. What did you see on the market? Why did you feel a need to start Degreed?
Sure. I got advice somewhere along the lines that someone said, being early is the same thing as being wrong. And Degreed, we were probably just honestly at risk of this idea. We were early with this idea. In 2012, it was still a time and place where college was the default pathway. The college degree was still sacred and sort of unchallenged. And as we've seen the skills gap grow, as we've seen the demand for lifelong learning increase, the world is starting to really reevaluate how we look at talent and think about how we measure people. So it is a really different world. But if you go all the way back to 2012, I'd say the one insight for me, I fell in love with education, became passionate, and even falling in love is maybe to romanticize it. I was kind of, more pissed off, honestly, at education. When I was graduating from high school and sat for the ACT, I was like, holy hell. This 3.5 hours is how the grownups decided they were going to sort all of us 17-year-olds in and out of our future. And I was like, no, not, this can't really be what all the grownups decided to do. Like, I was a bit pissed. And so I really started to think about education as a system and how is it going to need to change? And to come back to 2012, what was it? It actually did come right on the heels of the MOOCs. So exciting stuff was happening. There was disruption in the air, but everyone was working on content. Coursera, Udacity, Udemy, Pluralsight, lynda.com, edX, Khan Academy, Code Academy. All of the innovation in that moment in time was 100% on how do we democratize learning? How do we get the content and make it free or low cost and get it distributed across the world? And me and my brain and sort of experience, I was really hyper-focused on how do we signal, how do we credential, how do we answer for our education So while everyone else was kind of working on the content side of the equation, I was one of the few in that moment in time really thinking about the credential. And so, the short version, it's a long journey. We can double click on any of it, but I wanted to give people a way to answer for all of their education and skills. And it's still largely true today, but it was especially true in 2012, which is you ask someone, tell me about your education, and they will tell you where they went to university or that they didn't go. And there is such an absurdity to that. If I were to ask you, hey, to tell me about your health, and you said, oh yeah, I ran a marathon 21 years ago, that'd be an absurd way to answer for your health. But when I ask you, tell me about your education, 1,000 times in 1,000 people will say, oh, I graduated from SMU, as if that is an honest, rational, cogent answer to the question. It's not. And marathons aren't bad. And at the end of the day, neither is university. I'm really, believe in the system of higher education and the role it needs to play in this future. But it is all to say, we have to get, past this dependency on thinking that our formal education is the be all end all, that formal education is, the answer to what we know. It's not. And we've got to, continue to chip away at this future where everything you learn and all of your skills, they're there. You can see them. You can transact on them. They're going to unlock doors and gates just like the college degree did once upon a time. Like, that's the future we need.
That's such a good analogy. I will use that more in our sales pitches moving forward in terms of the marathon analogy. When you look at 2012, and you're spot on, where I think even when I pitch WorkRamp to venture capitalists, right away they think, oh, your market's the Coursera market or the Udacity market. And they don't think about the distribution and the software portion of it, which is where WorkRamp focuses, for example. Why create a new category, though, in 2012? Why not, again, go into the LMS category or an existing category at that time? Why did you want it to be different? Give us some backstory on that.
Sure. There's like a really generous framing, which is somehow, like it was all a deliberate, intentional choice or strategy, or the honest answer is I didn't set out to create a new category, and I didn't set out to create the next generation of corporate enterprise learning. It really was focused just on the problem statement. How do we help people answer for a lifetime of learning and skills? And we started to essentially work backwards from that. Okay, well, if it's really going to be lifelong, then it needs to be portable. It needs to be actually owned by the consumer. So Degreed actually got its start with the consumer profile, which is still live today. And we are kind of introducing the importance of that on the Degreed platform. Okay, well, if it's going to be all of your learning and skills, we need to be able to track your academics, your professional training and corporate learning, and all of the stuff you're doing informally on your own. And so we just started chipping away at that problem. All right, how do we ingest your college transcript? How do we integrate with all of the new MOOC platforms and all the new learning platforms? And then as we started into that corporate side of things, that's where kind of our vision started to meet the market and the needs that they had. And we were really keen to unlock enterprise because we believed even if people start tracking all their learning, if companies don't know or care, it's never really going to unlock things in your career and in your life the way that your college degree does. And so we knew we were going to need the buy-in of the corporations of the world. We're going to need their buy-in to start thinking this way for hiring, for development, for learning, for training, for internal mobility. And so we didn't know exactly. The short version is we kind of explored actually making Degreed a platform that companies could use for hiring, sourcing and hiring. And we ended up hitting friction. And then we started to explore using it as a platform to help in the learning development. And that's when it kind of came together. And so what our dream, our vision, our mission met kind of the needs that the corporate learning and development chief learning officers were feeling in that moment. And it was, kind of that marriage that really did then create the category. It unlocked, you know, it unlocked the use case, and it really happened at that point almost overnight. Degreed
That's
has
cool.
like this many years to becoming an overnight success kind of hockey stick in our story.
And I've blog posted about category redefinition. Like we're in the LMS category. We're basically
Mm-hmm.
redefining it much easier. And I'm saying, hey, whoever can actually define categories like the Qualtrics of the world, Degreed,
Yeah.
that is a much harder job. And I had never actually heard that origin story. So that's actually really cool to hear. I want to actually maybe see if you can take on this challenge of condensing about 11 years from your founding into a little bit more of a story here about the evolution of LXP, and then we'll kind of come to present day. But and I'm sure we could do a 3-hour podcast on your career journey at Degreed. But you also started 2 other companies during this time. You've taken the CEO role on again. Walk us through maybe the 2 things, the evolution of the LXP category in your personal journey, and then how they kind of came back to a head to present day. And then we'll jump into present day. But I'd love to hear about how you saw everything evolve over the last decade or so. It's gonna be a hard challenge if you can squeeze
Sure.
that in into an answer there.
Yeah, I mean it was a journey, and I wouldn't say we've kind of arrived per se. I've always loved reading about Walt Disney. Read a couple of biographies on him, just his personal journey. And there is always this kind of, I mean, especially you and I mean, just like Disney was already a global phenomenon by the time we were born. Like it just has always been there. It's always been the most successful storytelling, the most successful, animation studio. Like it was just always there. But of course that isn't true. He had to build it brick by brick. And the journey, was one of kind of leaping from one lily pad to the next for Disney. It was first Lucky the Rabbit, and then it was, Mickey Mouse, and then it was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and creating the first full length animated film, and then they would get to Fantasia and Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. The war would come. It would disrupt a lot of kind of their arc and their journey. It was precarious. Many times almost, went out of business. Bank of America was actually kind of the financier who stepped in, kept it alive. But then, television shows up after the war, and they start working on television and doing a series. And, and it was never it was never in a defensible place until they actually got to the parks, building the park. And then that created this kind of way in which it all connected together. And that's when it stabilized, and that's when it really began to be this platform by which they could tell any story and kind of connect it all back in together to rides and to merchandise and to series, and then it became the Disney that we kind of know. And I think for us, it's to say, hey, talk about category creation and LXP in the middle of the journey. I would say for us, I still think we kind of are in the middle of the journey. We're still jumping from one lily pad to the next. I think the future is still moving pretty fast. And for Degreed, what I think really the kind of what's analogous to Disney creating the parks, or the castle, what is the castle that you're going to defend? For us, it's always been moving to this world where skills is the currency. And so we were just solving one problem at a time and kind of going from one lily pad to the next. And I mentioned a couple of them to you. Okay, how do we track all your academic learning? Solve that problem. How do we track all of your informal learning? Okay, solve that problem. How do we track all your professional learning? Solve that problem. Okay, well, just tracking your inputs. You took a course, you read a book, you read an article, listened to a podcast. That doesn't immediately tell me what skills you have. So then it's solve the next problem. All right, translate activity into competencies. And well, that requires assessment and certification. And so, how do we think about that problem? And we've just been solving one problem at a time, all to this North Star. It's been there the whole time, which is we want to be the place that helps you answer for a lifetime of education and skills.
Mm.
And I think we're getting really close. And this takes us, maybe you want me to double click on some of the other things here in the middle. But, I really do believe some of it's the democratization of AI and the capabilities it's unleashed on the world. Some of it is the maturity of the market. We all needed to solve problems, one step at a time. But the market is coalescing really around skills-based organizations, skills-based hiring. Our capabilities of measuring and inventorying people's skills are getting better. And so I think we're there. I think we're just like right at the doorstep of what is going to be, this foundation that I think is going to affect how we think, learn, work now for decades. I think we're shifting from a role-based economy. We are shifting to a skills-based economy. Mm-hmm. And that is going to be fundamental. It's going to be radical. It's going to be hugely transformative. If we get it right, and there's always the risk of unintended consequences, but if we get this right, it's a more equitable future. It's less about where you went to school, and it's more about just, do you have the skill? And so, we're almost there.
So this might be a hot take, but I just came up with it while you're giving that answer. Would you say, even when you're talking customers or analysts, like our fellow analyst, Josh Person, would you say that people should stop thinking about this as a category of LXP, for example? Like, yes, that is a component of it, and think of this more around lifelong skills development. Like, would you actually, if you had the opportunity, redefine the category, or maybe help me coalesce the old category which you created and what you're saying around, hey, this is skills development for the future? How would you maybe think of those two things together? Or maybe they could both be true in the same sentence, right? It's a little harder of a question I'm going to toss at you.
No, I think it's very apropos. I think it's a great sort of insight, and maybe to borrow from my previous, analogy. It's kind of like just defining Disney circa 1938 as like an animation studio, and then just never being able to see in Disney anything but an animation studio, but you sort of get to like the Simon Sinek, start with your why. If you see Apple launch the, iPod, it didn't confuse anyone. But when, Dell launched, what was it, the Zune, or Microsoft launched the Zune, Microsoft, or whatever, it confused everyone.
Hopefully you didn't buy one.
Nope. Because look, Disney, his goal was never to be the world's biggest animation studio. He just wanted to tell stories, and every new technology that showed up, he took advantage of a new way of storytelling. When color showed up, he used color. When, TV showed up, he used TV. When, audio breakthroughs showed up, he used them. And then, he broke out of media. How do we tell these stories using, a ride? How do we tell these, how do we reinforce and tell story using character? How do we, I will say, if you think of Degreed strictly as an LXP company, the market probably is actually going to be confused by what we are about to do. But if you understand that our mission has always been to build this future, then it's just the next problem to be solved. It's just the next evolution it's the next step in that journey, and it feels coherent, And so I think, it's interesting because categories, just look, if we step back, not L&D, if we just think about like business startups, operating, leading, category creation is both this like serves you exceptionally well, but then it also sort of defines you. Your benefit, you've created a box, you've put yourself in a box. And like now all of a sudden that box, people have budget, analysts can call it something, everyone can coalesce around it. There can be conferences born, to help people understand it and mobilize to it. Like it does do a whole bunch of incredible things for you as a business, but then you're also in a box, and that can be limiting. So I hope everyone knows that Degreed is not satisfied just to be the creator and leader of the LXP category. Degreed is on a mission, and we're not stopping until you can transact on all of your learning and skills.
Hey everyone, wanted to take a quick commercial break within this really great episode with Dave Blake of Degree. Dave is talking about how he's created the LXP category and transformed it to be the leader of skill development. I also want to tell you about WorkRamp, which is the leader in the LMS category, Learning Management System category. We're building what you call the Learning Cloud. The Learning Cloud is your all-in-one LMS to serve both your employee and customer learning all in one platform. If you'd like to learn more about how we're transforming learning, customer education, and enablement at companies, come visit us at www.workramp.com. Now back to the show with Dave. We're talking a lot about skills now, and learning and skills is how you want to define your future. And I was doing my research ahead of time. I did a Control F on your product page, and you literally say skills 16 times. So you're probably SEOing really well on that page on skills. But my question is, and this is more for the L&D members of the audience, is how should we be looking at skills moving forward, especially for L&D professionals, and how they actually make skills a more important part of the organizations they serve? Give us your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Degreed in the message, in 2012, I felt a little bit like a, lone wolf out there sort of preaching a gospel that no one else, was thinking about or talking about. I do actually think this moment feels different in that it feels like it's a wave. It feels like it's upon us. It feels inevitable. And I'm seeing a lot of really great thinking coming from a lot of places, from the McKinseys and Deloittes of the world to the chief learning officers at, Citibank and, Unilever and otherwise. It definitely feels like this wave is here, but I think people are feeling it. We can talk a little bit about it, but I think actually what's maybe, most interesting is to try and look out 5-10 years and kind of understand what is this going to do to the world. Right now, so McKinsey published research about 2.5 months ago that talked about skills-based hiring is 3.5 times more effective than hiring based on academic credentials. And I would actually hope at this point that's not really a surprise to too many people. But blow your mind away, incredible is that skills-based hiring is twice as effective as hiring based on experience.
Wow.
And if you sit with that for just a second, because look, literally, it's literally billions of people are getting hired every year based on their work experience. 99% of all job interviews and all hiring is in the framework of, your work experience. And for skills-based hiring to be doubly, twice as effective is just really radical. And I think it does go to show that I think this is actually going to happen fairly fast. I think it's going to materialize pretty quickly. And it's not just a fad because it is, so much, it's just such a better way of operating and thinking.
What do you think changed in the world where maybe someone could argue in 2012 it was more of a fad? It's Dave preaching from the rooftops around skills. What do you think actually changed in the last decade that where you now truly feel like it's a wave that's unstoppable? Are there macroeconomic factors here, or maybe the technology caught up, or maybe you were just that persuasive?
Yeah, well, that's a generous way of thinking about it, but no, I mean, let's start with the macro because it's pretty simple and pretty clear actually, and I think does help to actually understand why such a radical shift in the world. There's two lines that cross that have never crossed before. We're in unprecedented times, and that is the rate at which technology can scale surpass the rate at which humanity can learn. And what we've had in the past, we've had these industrial revolutions, and that was a moment in time where technology surged. The change in technology advanced faster than humanity could adapt. but humanity did adapt and caught up. And so we've had these kind of surge moments. But why this is fundamentally different, and why I believe to think of this as like an industrial revolution, even like AI right now, to think of it as like somehow an industrial revolution that we're going to like absorb back into society and catch up to, it's not true. It's fundamentally different. And the difference is not the rate at which the technology advances. The difference is the rate at which the technology scales. And technology now scales faster than humanity can learn. So what that means is, in times past, the skills gap was essentially ebbed and flowed. It was these surges and then catch up. It was recessionary. It was corollary to recessions. In bad economies, it put people back into the labor force. In tight economies, it kept everyone working. What is fundamentally different is now technology scales faster than humanity can learn, which means the skills gap is getting bigger every day, week, month, and year. And we have no expectation that it will ever close ever again. And that's like radically, fundamentally different. We exist in a different context than we have ever existed ever before. The skills gap we have right now, we have no expectation that it will ever close again. There is nothing, AI included, that could help humanity catch up to the rate at which technology is scaling. So and it's why, and like, look, evidence of this, we're in a sort of recessionary environment right now, and yet we're also still in the tightest labor market we've ever been in. And that's the new normal, is that, and so the need for skills is going up, which means companies are starving for skills, which means it's forced them to start thinking differently and looking differently. And that's the force that's pushing this, is that they're starving for skills, and they have to get more efficient and better at both developing them, finding them, inventorying them, all those things. It's that macro force in behind it all.
Geez, that's probably the best framework I've heard of in terms of, hey, the why of skills today. It reminds me of, I remember at conference when Reed Hastings gave a simple analogy of like, think of the world before automobiles were invented. It was all about horses for many hundreds of centuries, right? And when the automobile hit, it transformed all of humanity, right? And you're almost talking along a similar vein, but with knowledge work and individuals and our capacity to advance as a civilization. So that is a good sales pitch if we had to go pitch to a CEO or L&D buyer there. Let me actually, we're coming up on time here. Let me actually close here with our Learn rapid fire round. Dave, there was so much great information that you shared with us. So many good sound bites there. I'm going to be able to use a lot of these as well too. This is going to be very well promoted, but let's go into our Learn rapid fire session. This is the session where I'll actually just ask you a few quick questions. You could give me 1 to 2 line answers for each of these. They're all focused on learning, right? And so the first question I'll ask you is, who have you personally learned the most from in life?
Let's see. Professionally, a woman named Dan Duane. I quote her every week of my life. She gave me the template by which to lead and to build companies. I think personally right now, there's a podcast by a woman named Jennifer Finlayson Fife. It's really all around kind of our relationships and marriage. And I really do appreciate the wisdom of others and the chance we have in today's day and age to learn from great minds.
And who was Anne? What was the relationship?
So Anne's the CEO of the first startup that I joined, Zinch. It would be acquired by Chegg, which is now one of the bigger ed tech publicly traded companies. Anne was the co-founder before that of military.com. And, just a really clear thinker, a really hard worker, and she had put in the work to translate, the things that had brought her success in her career. And that's a real gift, because you can see successful people and you can try and emulate them, but, not all of us do a great job at turning around and kind of codifying, the principles that we believe, drove it. And she did a great job at that.
That's great. That's great. All right. Next one. If you had all the time in the world, let's say you're on a beach, you can learn a new topic today. What's that topic you would love to learn about?
Yeah, it's summertime. I was on a beach just a week ago, so it's not that hard to think about, and was learning about hospitality. Love looking out at other industries to get tips, and AI. And I still have a lot in the curve around AI. And I feel like, all of a sudden we all have a lot to learn sort of on that front.
Well, you got to tell me, what have you picked up on the hospitality front that you want to bring back to the business? Anything unique?
Sure. Oh man, now I'm on the spot. The founder of Shake Shack is this great restaurateur.
Yep.
I'm blanking on his name. Danny.
I heard a podcast about him. He was like a former,
Yeah.
Was he a former salesman? I can't remember, or banker. I can't remember what it was.
But he, in his restaurants, and I've eaten at one or two of his restaurants to be able to attest to this, they enable everyone inside the organization to be able to essentially do whatever it takes, pull down the most expensive bottle of wine and give it to someone because it's their, anniversary, or because, they messed up the meal. Like, just enabling the organization to be able to mobilize that way. Being thoughtful at scale is really hard. When you have hundreds, thousands of customers, how do you be thoughtful at scale? And they sort of systematized being thoughtful, where every customer that comes into the restaurant, they take notes. And so they're able to follow up. And in eating at one of his New York restaurants, my wife and I were exchanging anniversary gift. And they found out that my wife is vegan, and it was our anniversary, and that we were there on vacation, and they themselves are a vegetarian vegan restaurant. But they came back, and 30 minutes later, they hand printed their recommended list of other vegan restaurants for my wife to try while she was in the city. And, it's just, think of what that took. It took being exceptionally, you're standing at the edge of the table, just reading, the day's specials. It took noticing that moment. It took running to the back room, finding stationery, doing research, typing it up, printing it off. And that is just the above and beyond. But he's inspiring in the ways in which he thinks about, service and the customer, and sort of that lifetime relationship. You can do it well, get it right.
And more tech companies can learn from him. So that's a great answer. Okay, last one I'm going to ask you is a career advice question, but what's the biggest piece of career advice you would give someone?
Absolutely. Right now, learning velocity is the most sustainable advantage any of us can have. It's the most sustainable advantage any organization can have. Learning velocity. Get good at learning.
All right, Dave, great final answer. Thanks so much for joining us. It was great having you. I had another 5 to 7 questions I could ask you, but that would be too long of a podcast, but it was great having you, Dave.
It was fun. Thanks so much.